What makes you happy? It might be that there's a specific thing that makes you happy. Or maybe it's spending time with someone that you love that makes you happy. It might even be that your work, your job, or your purpose in life is what makes you happy. Everything we do, for ourselves and even for other people, is in pursuit of happiness. Everything. So my question is, despite our best efforts and struggles, why is it so hard to just be happy? There are many different ways we could answer this question, but I want to focus on something very specific, very relevant, and very new. I say it's very relevant because you all probably have it in your back pocket right now. It's your phone. Phones have changed us. They've changed the way we think. They've changed the way we communicate. But most importantly, they've changed the way in which we consume information. We consume a lot. And most of the time, after a long session of mindless scrolling, we don't even remember what we have watched. Both scrolling and content consumption are starting to become part of who we are. So much so that it now has its own name: doomscrolling. To truly understand how doomscrolling impacts our brains and specifically our happiness, we need to understand the nature of one very important brain chemical: dopamine. So, dopamine has become a bit of a hot topic, especially as lots of us seek to reduce our phone usage. But with its rise in popularity, the idea of how dopamine works in the brain is generally misunderstood. People often think of dopamine as chemical happiness. This leads them to believe that the more dopamine they have, the happier they'll be. The truth is quite the opposite. And in fact, as we'll come to see, this rigorous pursuit of dopamine is precisely what's stopping most of us from achieving lasting happiness in the first place. So, how does dopamine work? Well, I'm going to try and explain it using a very oversimplified analogy. Consider this: donuts. Everyone loves them. They taste great, but what happens in your brain when you eat one? Let's say this is your first time trying a donut. You have no idea what it tastes like, no idea what to expect, so when you take a bite, you're pleasantly surprised at how great it tastes. Your brain absolutely loves the sugary glaze that coats the donut, and it immediately lets you know this by releasing dopamine. But by releasing dopamine, your brain isn't just telling you how much it loves this donut. It's telling you to take another bite. Your brain thinks very logically, and it now thinks that donuts are good for me. It wants more. It tells you that it wants more by releasing dopamine every time you take a bite. It's trying to get you to think of this donut as something that you need for your survival. So what do? You take another bite, and the same thing happens. Your brain thinks, oh my god, this is amazing. We need more of this. It releases more dopamine, you take another bite, and this cycle repeats itself over and over and over until you finally finish the donut. So, at its core, dopamine is not really about happiness. It's more to do with motivation. Dopamine is released in your brain when your brain wants you to do something that it thinks will be beneficial for your survival, just like motivating you to take another bite of a donut. This would have been very useful for things like hunting, gathering, and quick decision making, which were all roles of early human beings. A caveman's brain knew that animals were a good source of food, so it released dopamine and motivated the caveman to hunt these animals. That was the original purpose of dopamine release. Regrettably, our society is a bit more complicated than just hunting and gathering. We are absolutely drowning in dopamine. We're always surrounded by so many people, always exposed to so many options and choices. There's always something to do that stimulates dopamine release in our brains. Our society is dependent on excess amounts of quick and easy dopamine. The Greek physician Hippocrates said, "Anything in excess is opposed to nature." But isn't excess the exact direction towards which we're heading? On that note, let's circle back to phones. If there's one modern-day source of dopamine that has most of us in a chokehold, it's scrolling. Scrolling works just like a donut. Scroll, dopamine release. Scroll again, dopamine release again. This motivates you to move your thumb across your screen, to see another video, answer a text, or check your group chat. And the reason why all of this is so addictive is because it's so easy. Moving your thumb across your screen is so easy for your brain to do, especially when, in return, it receives such large amounts of dopamine. This is what's keeping you hooked. Our brains are not yet evolved to cope with this level of stimulation, and it's impacting every other part of our lives. The normal things that you do every single day give you a release of dopamine. But the amount that's released from our small day-to-day tasks is nothing compared to how much is released when we scroll. But why does this even matter? Well, without going too much into the biology of things, this is a synapse. It's essentially a junction between two neurons or brain cells where a nerve impulse passes from the first neuron to the second neuron. It's in these synapses where we can find dopamine. It's released by the first and binds to the second to continue the nerve impulse. Let's say that you've just gone on a walk. It was a great walk. It was sunny, you had your music in, you were surrounded by nature, and you feel great. Dopamine is released and it looks something like this, where some molecules move across the synapse to continue the nerve impulse. Now, in a different scenario, let's say that before you go on a walk, you scroll on your phone for 10 minutes. Even before you leave your house, your synapse is already saturated with dopamine. When you go on your walk, listen to your music, and surround yourself with nature, dopamine is still released on top of this. But it can't make you happier if your synapse is already saturated. It's like pouring a glass of water into the ocean. Slowly, as we become more and more addicted to scrolling, it becomes harder to appreciate what's already around us. Life overall starts to lose its color. Be honest, how many times a day do you pick up your phone and scroll? Each time you do this, you reinforce it as a habit. It gets to the point where you don't even make the conscious decision to pick up your phone and scroll, but it happens to you, almost like a reflex. There's something called neuroplasticity, which is a biological process where our repeated thoughts and repeated actions change the structure and layout of neural cells in the brain. These changes make it easier for our brain to think these thoughts and do these actions, and this is exactly how habits, both good and bad, are formed. Once the structure of your brain starts to shift, it's difficult to reverse. It is possible, but it's difficult. And in our case, what's the best way to reverse it? Very simple. Use your phone less. You can make this easier for yourself. Try charging your phone in a different room instead of right by your bed. That way, it's not the first and last thing you see each day. Or it could be as simple as logging off your socials for a while, if you have to. It really depends on whatever works for you. Whenever I speak to people my age about childhood and growing up, invariably they always wish they could go back and relive those memories. I understand. Who doesn't miss their childhood? No work, no job. All you did was eat, sleep, play, and do whatever a child does. We think that having no responsibilities as children is what made life so good. Actually, what made our childhood so special was that we were always present. We were always present and sincere, always observing things, even if it meant asking stupid questions. Everything we did had our undivided attention. And now we're struggling to rekindle this happiness in life. Is it because the world around us has changed? Or is it because we can no longer appreciate it? We claim that happiness is so hard to find, but what we don't realize is that the things and people that make us happy surround us. But each time we make the decision to scroll, they become more and more invisible. The moments that make life so beautiful are still there. Make sure that you are mindful enough to see them. A good place to start is to ask yourself the question, what makes you happy? Thank you.